Okay, so we're going to come back, Tom?
Yeah, I think we should. I'll let you know as soon as I see him on or get confirmation that he's able to join.
Okay, I'll get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. We got a lot of ground to cover, so we're going to try to jump right in. So just as a matter of introduction, I wanted to take you back a couple of weeks. For those of you who were on the calls, I think it was the 15th and 16th, Monday and Tuesday, we were discussing quite a few proposals. Some were related to kind of this big landscape level kind of view of the state with certain areas that might be designated for passive management, some for active. We were talking about reserves and the necessity to further preserve certain areas. But we got to the end of the day on Tuesday, and I remember, we were kind of back and forth, and we couldn't find any consensus really. We were kind of stuck. And I think it was Tom who said towards the end of the Tuesday meeting, he kind of challenged us all to kind of think long and hard before our next meeting, to think about areas where we could, compromise, collaborate, et cetera, because it felt like we were back at the very beginning where we were kind of, we were kind of at opposite ends and very opposed. So following that meeting, the co-chairs, we had about a 3-hour meeting on Friday, 3.5-hour meeting, actually, I think it was. I remember it well. It just kept going and going and going. And we were just, conversing about where do we go next? Where do we take this conversation? We have a charge. We're really doing our darndest to make this meaningful for everybody at the end of the day, that we would be able to go back to the senator with hopefully some good information and some consensus items. So during that conversation, we kind of landed on this idea of maybe a survey, because it seemed like we were maybe missing something, or we needed a better idea of kind of where this group was. So we put together this survey to really just kind of take the temperature of the group. And a survey is not perfect. This survey wasn't perfect, but our goal was to kind of create a few buckets and try to just see where people were. So we chose to kind of create three buckets where we could kind of somewhat group people. Again, we understand it wasn't perfect. We could have created 27 different buckets, but that would have further complicated the conversation. So we chose to just try to keep it very simple. So I just share all that to share that was the heart behind the survey. That was why we did the survey. We're trying hard to move this conversation along, and so we kind of figured out that, hey, we got to talk about this tree cutting, this logging idea, and see where people are at and how we can move this conversation forward, what that might look like. So that's the backstory of the survey. And now Eileen and Anjali are going to get into some of the results just to kind of help you see what we're looking at, which is helping us kind of guide these conversations. So Eileen, it's all you.
Okay, so just one more thing before I get to some of these results is that we've invited some representatives from the task force who have been participating pretty regularly to share their points of view. And not to be rigid in a point of view, but to share their thoughts overall within the context of these results, because there's some interesting results here that we think you're going to think about as well. Listen to the presenters, and then we'll have some dialogue. We'll have some clarifying questions. So let's just go ahead. I'm going to share the first question. Again, we divided these two questions up because as we were listening to some of the discussions, it wasn't really clear about, is it the cutting the trees themselves that is that people are opposed to, or was it really the removal of the wood products? That's why we separated those two questions. So I'm going to share the results of the first question, which was cutting trees. So I hope that you can see it. Am I sharing? Do you see a pie chart? And
we see the zoom on top of the pie chart.
How about now?
Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we didn't want to put actual numbers out here, but we wanted to give you a feeling for where the majority and where we think we can grow some consensus is within the people who responded to this survey. So you'll see there really is there's some majority in that middle of the line option, which was cutting trees is an activity or tool that can only be used as part of an approved forest stewardship plan, so long as the objective pertains to the overall ecological health, current and future, of that particular forest. So most people were okay with that. Now, you know, there needs to be some definition. Some people wanted to know, what do you mean by ecological health and what's the plan? But overall, that idea resonated with people. They liked it. There were minority opinions, but not insignificant numbers, who felt that there is no circumstance when you can cut a tree. That's the blue. And an almost equal number, a little bit more, felt that you could cut trees. Cutting trees is an activity that can be used as part of an approved plan for a variety of objectives, including the generation of revenue. So that's this yellow. So these were informative results for us. We do think that there's room in this big orange for some consensus amongst these participants. We're going to see, you know, as a result of discussions and sharing today and tomorrow. What we're going to do is, we're not taking questions yet. We're going to present these two results, hear from our speakers, all 6 of them, and then it's going to be opened up mostly for questions, clarifying questions. And then after your questions have been answered, we're going to have a guided discussion. Because again, there's no secret here. We want to guide you to consensus. We want to reach consensus. We don't want to get to voting. So that's going to be the format for today and tomorrow. Discussing the survey, presenting some insights and options from people representing different positions, clarifying questions, that is, you didn't understand something and you're asking a question, and then guided conversation. Okay, so Anjali, I think you are up to discuss question number 2 on wood products, and I'll pull that up for you.
Yeah, thank you, Eileen. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay, good. And Julia, I saw that you raised your hand. We will take that question after we finish with all of this. Thank you, Eileen. So unfortunately, question number 2, which is the removal of wood products from the forest, was not as obvious as question number 1. The results for this question in the survey, it was more evenly distributed. So that kind of tells us that it's harder to reach consensus, because there are many different people in all areas of the spectrum. So to remind everybody, in blue here, the removal of wood products should never be permitted. Then in red, which is slightly the majority, but not really, it's the removal of wood products is an activity and or a tool that can only be used as part of an approved plan, as long as the objective pertains to the overall ecological health. And as Eileen just mentioned, you know, there are some questions about, like, you know, the definition of ecological health objectives, and that's definitely something that we should discuss today. And then in the yellow is that the removal of wood products is an activity or tool, and then the caveat, the difference between the red and the yellow, is that the DEP can make revenue from this. So these results were definitely surprising, at least to me, to see, but because it's not that clear cut that we can reach consensus with the red or the yellow or the blue, we decided to bring 6 different people that can speak to why is it necessary that you would need to remove wood from the soil, or just a wood product out of the forest, or why is it necessary to keep it and never remove it? What would be an ecological health objective that you should remove that wood product or that you should not? So Tom, I don't know if you want to give Chief Mann an opportunity before we go into the speakers, because I know that's going to take a long time. Tom, can you hear me? thinking that was a 1 second.
Yeah, sorry. I was just checking to see if there was any word from him. I don't believe that he's joined us at this point, so I think we just need, oh, wait, hold on a
We'll
second.
go, okay.
Oh, it says the host is waiting to let him in. Do you see anything in the
No,
that
I see everybody saying,
link that was given to him via email is saying the host is waiting to let him in? No?
mm-mm. Oh no, this is Matt Polsky.
Do you know if I were to just give him a phone number, can he just call right in, or does that still require like the host letting a phone number in?
Yeah,
It still requires.
so what I'm
You have
gonna
to
do,
pre-register to join by phone?
I think everybody goes through the same process, but what I'm gonna do to keep everything moving is to start with the discussion, and then I will send you the link again, just to make sure that he has the right info. I'll coordinate with you behind the scenes, Tom, okay?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so as I was saying, everybody, so we reach out to 6 different participants of this task force to share with us their points of view as to why you need to remove wood products or not ever remove them. So Leslie Sauer, Sara Webb, and Emile DeVito are going to discuss as to why you shouldn't remove wood products. And then Bob Williams, Matt Olson, and Kristen Meistrell will then discuss on the other side of the spectrum, what are the different types of ecological health objectives to which you can remove wood from the forest without any issues. So I'm going to start with Emile, and I advise everybody to just try to keep it to like max of 5 minutes, so that because it's 6 people, so that way we can get to clarifying questions and then we can get to discussion. So Emile, can you raise your hand? Like maybe, oh, there you are. Oh, you're unmuted. So go ahead, Emile.
Okay. So mostly what I wanted to talk about in my, do I have 5 minutes?
Yes, you do. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, mostly what I wanted to talk about was sort of what I've seen over the years and relate it to, you know, what's happening now and what we're debating. So over the last 35 years, I've seen almost all of the projects that have occurred on public lands. And the thing that concerns me most is that, with the exception of a few, most of them have not reached their targets. I can give you an example of a couple of good ones. For example, there was a blueberry field that had grown up into a pine forest in New Jersey Audubon's Hovnanian Sanctuary down near Toms River. And I don't know the method of that by which they removed any material from the forest, but they put up a fence to deal with the deer issue, and they planted Atlantic white cedar trees, and the Atlantic white cedar is doing very nicely. The fence definitely protected it for a number of years. And to tell you the truth, I don't know if they removed that pine material as wood chips. They may have, or they may have just sort of mulched it all in when they originally did that project. But that was a really good project in that they successfully are getting their target, which is they restored a diminishing habitat, right? A habitat that we know in New Jersey, we've lost about 80% of our Atlantic white cedar forest. New Jersey Conservation Foundation has done a couple of small Atlantic white cedar projects where we had open wetlands, where we fenced and planted Atlantic white cedar. And those are meeting with varied success. Sometimes the fence isn't enough to keep out the deer. And and then there are a number of projects I know that some others have done with fences. The state did one in Penn Swamp where they put up a fence, part of a research project in the late 1980s. And the only place that the Atlantic white cedar came back in any significant way was inside the deer fence, where they took care of the #1 problem facing the forest, the deer. And so that's regrowing a cedar swamp. And there are some projects like that on private land, I'm sure. But the lion's share of places where Atlantic white cedar has been cut and lost over the last half century or even century, we've lost the cedar. It's grown back to maple and gum. And the primary reasons why we're losing the cedar have not been dealt with. So again, lots of cedar was removed from the forest. Lots of Atlantic white cedar was removed that would have lived for centuries longer, continuing to sequester carbon. And in the lion's share of those places, the cedar has never returned. So that's the important take-home message, that yes, you can work really hard and you can sometimes achieve your objective, but many times it doesn't work. Now, I just got back from Tioga County, Pennsylvania. I was camping in the Grand Canyon of Pennsylvania, and I saw miles and miles and miles of shelterwood cuts with interpretive signs talking about the need to regenerate the oak forest. And these cuts, which ran between shelterwood cuts and seed tree harvest, were essentially are clear cuts, just without using the word clear cut, because nobody likes that word. There was hardly an oak tree to be found. These projects were 5, 10, 15, 20 years old, and they've all regenerated into ferns and birch trees and maple trees, and in some cases, sassafras trees. Hardly an oak to be found anywhere, failing miserably. All those oak forests removed. Now, some people say, well, the FIA data shows that our oak forests are declining, and that, the future forest tends not to be oak in the understory of those forests. And in many cases, that's true, because natural succession, oak forests generally don't succeed themselves unless there's fires, or unless, so the deer pressure is removed, or unless there's, really dry spells, like as you get toward the prairie forest border out in the Midwest, where oak forests renew themselves more easily. And so it's really hard to renew an oak forest. And the last thing we should be doing is taking away our oak forests under the guise that we're creating oak forest, because it's not working. The lion's share of those projects are failing miserably. And I challenge anyone to show me a preponderance of places where those oak forests are being renewed. The Magnolia Road project in the Pine Barrens, which is only a few years old, and we supported that project, New Jersey Conservation Foundation did. The deer density is too great. The only thing coming up in that forest are pines, and the oaks are all being browsed. So in many cases, we're removing tons of material from these forests, tons of sequestered carbon, and we're not getting back the target species. The reason we did the project in the first place is to promote a declining habitat, and it's not working. So I'm very concerned about that.
Emile,
in my view,
you're almost done. Sorry for
I'm almost done. So in my view, we need to be managing our forest gaps so that they come back as native species. New Jersey Conservation Foundation is managing a forest gap in our Hill and Dale Preserve in central New Jersey, where there was a big blowdown of a bunch of oak trees. We left all the material there. We put up a deer fence. We planted a few oak saplings. Well, the oak trees are regenerating fantastically, even beyond the ones that we planted, because we kept out the deer. Great Swamp Watershed Association has about a 20 to 25 acre deer fence in the headwaters of the Great Swamp. The pin oak forest, it's in 20 years, it's regenerating so thick that you can't even see through it anymore, where there was no oak regeneration beforehand. So we have many examples where we attack the primary problem and we get the forest we want, and we don't have to remove anything from the forest and lose all that sequestered carbon.
Thank you, Emile.
And I can expand on all these ideas in the discussion.
Thanks, Emile, so much. Do we have Sara Webb? I don't see you, Sara.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. So we're ready to go? Seems
Yes,
odd.
you have 5 minutes.
Okay,
Thank you.
seems odd not to have a PowerPoint going. So I'm Sara Webb. I've been doing research and teaching and restoration in New Jersey forests for the last 35 years. I have a forestry degree and PhD in ecology, and put into the chat a statement from the Natural Heritage Committee, which many of you are familiar with. A large group of people that are participating in this process came up with language that I hope that people will take a moment to read. Basically says, I'll read it quickly: to maximize climate resilience, no wood or forest products shall be removed from publicly owned forests, and all management activities must sustain and expand carbon uptake and storage. All woody material must be left in the forest as habitat and as carbon sequestered in the soil. Invasive or infected plants or those that pose a hazard must be managed on site rather than moved and disposed of elsewhere. So that's something for people to consider and think about as a position for from a large number of participants in this process. I'd like to speak a little bit from my own perspective. I have very deep concerns about what's really logging management on most of our New Jersey public lands, which particularly is disturbing our natural and most mature protected forests, which are theoretically protected. And this view is shared by the state's ecologists, conservation biologists, botanists, natural lands experts, by many professionals, as well as very knowledgeable amateurs. And this is a nationwide fight we are seeing for state and national conservation lands to keep the wood in the ecosystem and to stop logging the old trees. It's kind of like keep the coal in the ground, keep our carbon storage and sequestration machines in our trees. It's really unwise for climate, for water, and for our most threatened wildlife. So we have a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. And the status quo is really logging centric. And I think that's why we don't, in that survey result, have a great consensus on the view with a plan, because today's stewardship plans are very logging intensive, and many people become cynical about the plan concept because many people like myself don't believe that clearing the canopy is a good idea. And many people have the impression that our forests must be thinned and managed to be healthy. And yes, management, but it does not need to be clearing of vast swaths of canopy of the old marketable trees. And the experience many of us have had at Sparta and other state lands recently have been problematic and incorrect about the forest age and health. There's really no natural analog to those large openings, nor to any kind of natural disturbance that would remove the wood. And the biggest problem is after these clearings, the forest does not come back. When we open the canopy, we do not get a nice new young forest because of the deer, which Emile spoke about eloquently, and the invasive species, especially in North Jersey. Those are the true enemies of the future forest, and we need to be doing restoration rather than logging management. We really need this new approach to our public forest to protect them from canopy clearance, because that facilitates those problems and does not give us a new forest, from thinning and harvesting, and from removal of the wood. And this is to preserve biodiversity and climate resilience. So there really should be no management that reduces our climate resilience. We are in a climate crisis that puts more carbon in the atmosphere, and that's what happens when forests are cleared. And let's be very clear about climate warming and forests. There's a lot of misinformation out there. Basically, carbon goes from the air into the leaves, it builds biomass of the tree and the entire food web. The more leaves, the more carbon is absorbed, and that goes to the tree and the ecosystem and the soil and out of the atmosphere. So there's two parts to carbon there. The storage, which is enormous in our larger trees. And when they are cut down and taken out of the ecosystem, we lose a huge amount of carbon biomass. And then young trees may grow faster and taller, but not as much biomass. And the other part of carbon uptake and storage is uptake. And again, the amount of carbon being taken up by our large trees and our intact forest is orders of magnitude larger than small trees. There's misperception that smaller trees grow faster and therefore absorb more carbon. And the scientific literature, which everyone should be looking at rather than she said, he said, or even reports that are often passing along information that have been shared on people without scientific studies. That's where we need to look for the real information. A 200-year-old tree today will keep on absorbing and storing more carbon for another century or more. So people really need to look at the scientific literature for their understanding of this and recognize we have a problem. So there's a little mini lesson on climate, but then I know I have only a little time left. I just urge you to look at the scientific literature that I and others have posted on the website for this with our proposals. So we do not need thinning and clearing of large forests.
You're almost done.
I'm almost done. Okay. Yeah. All right. I just want to say a few more things. I've already said that deer are a problem, and so are invasive species. When we have openings and harvest, we get those invasions. And there's a myth, again, that large trees do not stop sequestering carbon. That's not true. I want to say a word about the word proforestation, which has become a hot potato in our discussions. And this has become a swear word in some circles. And it is simply the policy of protecting our oldest and most intact forests and our native trees, especially on forest lands. There should be no harvest. We should be keeping the old trees and the wood on site. and not be harvested or managed or stewarded through logging. Is often not called logging when the clearings are made. So we lose these carbon sequestration services into the future for hundreds of years. And we really have to get on with protecting these ancient forests and not generate young forests out of the old forest. We have plenty of disturbed ground in New Jersey. We have invaded woodlands. We have agricultural lands that are in state ownership where we can grow young forest in order to have more of that, rather than carving up our most intact and oldest forests where we should keep the canopy closed, keep those carbon-rich trees there. And so we have this crisis, and for ecological resilience and diversity, we should be changing the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Up next, Leslie and Tom. I know we have Chief Man. If you want to do the 3 first, and then Chief Man, and then we do the other 3.
Yes,
Okay with
yes.
everybody?
Chief Man is on with us. Chief, we're going to turn to you in about 5 minutes. So
Yes.
just hold on, and thanks so much for joining us.
All right, Leslie. For some reason, I don't see people today. Leslie, are you on? Oh, there you are, Leslie. You can unmute yourself.
And now I can. Thank you.
There you go.
I just want to give a brief introduction. I've been involved in focusing on ecological restoration of forests basically my whole life. My first restoration project was in the 1970s when I taught at Penn, and we worked in the Wissahickon, starting the Wissahickon Restoration Volunteers, who are still active today. I started a business that over time that focused on ecological planning, and we did forest restoration all over the country, from Texas to California, New York, Louisville, a lot of work in forests very similar to New Jersey's, in that they're fairly used and disturbed. And I'm old. I'm one of the oldest people here, probably on this Zoom. And I remember when some of the arguments about removing trees actually worked. I remember when you could stimulate growth in the understory by removing a tree, but that hasn't been true for a very long time, as Emile was pointing out. I also want to touch on Sarah's swear word, proforestation. When you look at the word, it means letting the forest grow till its full ecological potential. That's almost synonymous with what natural restoration is. Trying to get a landscape back on a natural trajectory to realize its full ecological potential. They're really very, very similar. And both of them are totally stymied by the fact that right now, deer are literally eating the next generation. And so all those prescriptions become largely a joke. And of course, invasives follow very quickly. I think the big difference between an ecological restoration focus and a silvicultural focus is, with an ecological restoration, I really can't think of any time when you're going to choose to remove large trees. If you have yourself a nice oak forest getting older, it's on the right trajectory. You're not going to disrupt that. Typically, what ecological restoration focuses on is the ground, small material, where regeneration is happening. As Emile said, to me, the gaps are everything. They're the future. They're the forest that we're going to have, that the forest that's growing on its own. And instead of managing it, we're going off into the least disturbed sites, removing large trees in an effort to make something that's like a gap that's never going to be as nice as what it once was there. These kinds of gaps also have to be too large, like 10 acres, in order to allow not to be overwhelmed by deer browse, so they just make more deer browse. If we actually managed real gaps that are happening all over New Jersey, between oak and blowdown, et cetera, we would actually be making the kinds of gaps that are needed by the species of the interior forest and not just edge species. Most of what we do now is make a gap for edge species. If we actually manage real gaps, we could do other things too. We can probably get oak back because that's where they're going to come back. We could be managing for oak, as Emile and Hazel were pointing out. That's what we found in our own gaps. We can do all kinds of management. Prescription burning, for example, is known to, not not lose carbon, to help save carbon. I think the biggest problem is that we don't have much time, and we act like we have a lot of time. 40 years have gone by and we've done very, very little. Trees, large trees, and all of our trees are the most important things we have. A proforestation, or whatever you call it, ecological restoration, is all going to be about protecting trees. Am I willing to sacrifice a few small trees in order to manage for an endangered species? Absolutely. They're contributing very little at this point of time. Will I do some compensatory planting of native species? Let's hope I do that too. But the bottom line is I'm not going to disrupt the trajectory of a maturing forest, especially to do something that is related to a young forest. I think we've got to protect things now. And I appreciate the desire to map out different kinds of things and where should have what kind of management. How long is that going to take? What we know is that public land is public land. We can save it now. We, in fact, should have a moratorium until it's been saved. And then we should focus on ecological restoration, which will begin with some kind of inventory that we haven't even done yet before we come up with ideas about who to cut, how to manage, how much young forest to have, and things like that.
Leslie, oh, sorry, I was going to say, you're almost done, but you finished? Sorry.
Well, basically I am. Yeah, I would also like to remind people that we need to get this heavy equipment out of the forest. Virtually all of the work that I've done, virtually all of the work that Emile and I have talked about needing can be done with people with backpacks and backpack equipment and small equipment. We don't have to damage our forest in order to save our forest. And again, once we stop looking to impacting our older forests, our maturing forests, what the feds are going to call old growth, 80 years plus, we don't have to do any of that. We can accomplish all of these goals through gap management, prescribed burning, and a lot of other techniques that restorationists have used for decades. I'd like to say, you tell me something I have to cut a big tree for. Tell me why that's going to lead to ecological health.
Thank you, Leslie. I just want to point out, everybody, that the discussion is really about removal of wood, not cutting trees. We were focusing on that. So if the next three participants, if you can please focus on that.
Angela, isn't it about both?
Oh, both? Okay, I thought we were focusing
It
on
is
the
about
removal.
both. I think.
Okay, so I
all three
apologize.
discussed both, and
Okay.
the next three, I believe, are prepared to also talk about both. They're
Okay.
related. They're related but different, right?
I apologize, everybody, then. So Tom, Chief Man, please.
Okay, great. So now we're really pleased that we're joined by Chief Man. And while I'm introducing the chief, if someone could ask him to unmute and make sure we're able to hear from him. I know that we all have talked about and really wanted to get a Native American perspective on our forests and public lands. And so that's why we're so happy that Chief Man agreed to participate in the task force and that he's able to share a few thoughts with us today, hopefully, so when we get all the technical issues worked out. Chief Man is chief of the Turtle Clan of the Ramapo Lenape Nation. And I'm sure he will tell us more about himself and the clan and how they're interacting with our forests and his views on how we should be thinking about our forests. So hopefully at this point, we can hear from Chief Man.
Anishi, Tom, thank you. Kiha Kolomolsi, Ninja Shinzi Kikai Man, Nunjiai Lamawo Tikwa, Lamawo Wanjikyu. How is everybody doing? My name is Chief Man. I come from the Turtle Clan of the Ramapo Muncie Nation, as well as the mountains. Not to outdo myself, but sitting next to me is my wonderful, incredible savior, Miss Michaeline. And I really want to start by, I guess, thanking Ms. Murphy on clarifying that a little bit there, because I do have a lot to say in regards to both. And so a little background for everyone who doesn't know who we are or where the Turtle Clan is in regards to all of this. The Ramapo-Muncie people have resided in these mountains for 12,000 years. We are simply one community among other communities that are known as tribes or nations by the federal government. We have two communities in Wisconsin, one known as Brotherton, the other one known as the Stockbridge-Muncie. We have another one in Kansas, known as the Kansas Muncie. We have actually three others in Canada: Moravian Town, Muncie Delaware Nation, and Six Nations Canada. Together, we really make the Muncie Nation. We're the ones who gave up a tremendous amount of things by being the ones who were chosen to stay here to protect, our ancestors' bones and our hunting grounds and our fishing areas. Our other communities that I mentioned, they were able to, through all their struggles and suffrages, were able to maintain a lot of those other cultural things. And together today, we work cohesively to bring, those two things back together. People back to the land, the cultural ways back to the people who were chosen to be here. The Ramapo applied for federal recognition. We were denied. It was a political war against our people by former presidents of the United States to former congressmen, senators, former congresswomen, and the Attorney General's office and the 7 title insurance companies of the state of New Jersey, and some other people. While the whole country and all the academics and historians and archaeologists and anthropologists and other Native nations who are related to us supported our bid for federal recognition. We now enjoy state recognition by law. And what else is important about that is Governor Corzines Executive Order 122, which everyone should be aware of, as well as the 2007 report, which is what he saw and read, and then created that executive order. The Turtle Clan in the early 1960s, Ford Motor Corporation had purchased 900 acres in Ringwood, including all the Ringwood mine area, which is historic. Not just historic, between our ancestors and those mines. It is the reason why everyone here on this call enjoys the liberty and the freedom that you do. Our Ramapo mines were responsible for the first 900 cannonballs of the Revolutionary War. The Muncie Ramapo people who stayed here sided with those rebels who became known as the Americans. The steel that holds the dome over the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and the Lady of Freedom on top of that comes from our mines. The chain across the Hudson that was being built, some of those links were forged in our mines. And so in the 1960s, Ford bought that land. They attempted to remove 1,100 Turtle Clan members who were still residing in the same area. That Peter Hasenclever back in 1764 acknowledged that we were there well after the Treaty of Easton, actually by 8 years. Treaty of Easton, not a removal document. We reserved the right to hunt, fish, gather, strip bark from trees. The stripping bark from trees is something that everybody likes to ignore, and I mean everybody. No one has ever acknowledged it. And the reason why we stripped bark from trees was for our wigwams, for our homes. We only reverted back to pre-colonization by hunting, fishing, and gathering. not creating the Three Sisters farms. And so when Ford did that, there was public outcry. They were trying to build a $50 million executive housing complex that would be self-contained from business, from schools to gas stations to stores. The town of Ringwood would have realized $1 million a year in tax revenue from there. When Ford lost that right to remove our people, almost immediately in 1964, not in 1967, which they claim, they began to dump the toxic material from the Mahwah plant. And they didn't just dump it in the mines, they dumped it on the lands which we hunted and fished on and gathered on for medicinal and wild edibles. They was dumped on in the yards. The town of Ringwood wrote a letter to Henry Ford's grandson requesting that every single bit of those industrial wastes that was generated by Mahwah be disposed of in our community. That, my friends, is a form of eugenics, right? We see eugenics today where they take, or back in the day where they took an apple tree and, put a pear tree to it, right? That is actually the beginning of eugenics. It continues today where like we grow hemp and they take two different strains to make a different strain, right? And eugenics was born out of that. We look at what took place to our people. And then we still look at it as that, right? It's genocide, and it cannot be classified in any other way. And that tells you about who the Turtle Clan is and the Ramapo are and the Munsee speaking people. Our territory is from the Raritan River north, just south of Albany, eastern Pennsylvania, Manhattan, and western Connecticut. Some say as far as the Connecticut River, right? The Munsee speaking people are the oldest people who are from the Lenape speaking people, and also the Algonquin speaking people. So every other nation that you know of who are Algonquin, their language descends from ours, period. There is no other discussion. And with that, right, that is just the truth since archaic time. So coming forward, Michaeline and I created Munsee Three Sisters Medicinal Farm to support our community because the governmental agencies, federal, state, local, county, all abandon our people. So we figured that we would grow vegetables, and we hold free farmers markets now where we're upwards of about 4,000, 5,000 pounds this year to the community where those vegetables are grown in a natural way. Some might call it organic, but I refuse to. And so we also created Ramapo Culture and Land Foundation. And Ramapo Culture and Land Foundation is a way for us to become the stewards of our land once again. In a colonial system, we have to hold title to it. We need to preserve those lands so that we can then once again utilize them for the betterment and benefit of our ancestors and our descendants and ourselves, which means that we need those things to access our medicinal medicines. We need to access the medicinal foods. We need to access that we can go in and set up hunting camps, which is communal, where we can actually, harvest the deer that we can process and then have for our communities throughout the year. We are the people that need to be managing our wildlife, and we're the people who need to be managing our public lands, because we see it that all public lands are held in trust for us, and not just the people of the state of New Jersey. When you talk about removing those elders, those grandfather trees, it literally is killing my relative, period. The direction trees possibly as well. We have directional trees that are out there. No one's looking for those directional trees. We know they're there. We see them. The only way that we'll know if they're there in those old growth forests is if we're the ones who are contracted to go in there to actually do an investigation into the ceremonial stone landscape, which is comparable to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. If you went over there or I went over there and damaged that wall or destroyed it, I'd be killed. And that is the cold hard truth. And so we need those things to be protected. Governor Corzine's Executive Order 122 says that everybody in the state of New Jersey who works for them is tasked with protecting them because they are sacred places to us. These over here in Sparta Mountain, every single one of those grandfather trees that were removed from there is a cut in our skin. It's a whip across our back. Our relatives, we cannot go there and visit. We cannot go there and apply our hands to them and close our eyes and see everything that they've seen over the last 80 years or 100 years. All of the mountains in the state of New Jersey, all of the forests here in the state of New Jersey, as a matter of fact, all of the forests in the Northeast, right, which comparatively have been removed the 4 times, right? So this is the 5th time that we're looking at this. It's happening in my lifetime. And when I see this, right, when I see this, it doesn't anger me. It saddens me, right? Because that means that that tree that saw the last 80 years go by, witnessed everything. And while we are spiritual people and we are connected and understand that our forests are our relatives, we can't as human beings control it. And as the woman who was speaking earlier said, Mother Earth can take care of herself. She does not need the involvement of human beings. Where the human being aspect comes into in legislation and actions is because we want to see things be controlled. We need to control the speed. We need to control the air. We need to control the soil. We need to control the water. We need to control everything in society. Colonial society is been born to have that kind of thought process, and it is not going to work. Anybody who is in the ecological world, right, needs to understand how we are a part of it. And when any time that any forest is destroyed, it'll never come back, right? That is another part that will never, ever, ever heal. Just like the Delaware National Park, right? That has been healing 30, 40 years since the 1970s when all of those homes were removed out of there. That forest, the land, our ancestors' remains, the ceremonial stone landscape that's there, the directional trees, the animals who are our relatives, right? They've all been healing everywhere here in New Jersey. That mistake that's taken place over there in Sparta Mountain is beyond a mistake because we have relatives that live there that are no longer living because of the actions of human beings. Climate change is not climate change. Climate change is human change. And this is all connected. Everything in our life from our perspective, right? When you take those things away, they don't come back. And if they don't come back, then we as human beings get closer to the day that we'll be the one of millions of species that live upon Mother Earth that are not going to come back. When we remove an 80-year-old tree, how many tens of thousands of trees do we have to replace it with to get the same carbon capture? That's insane. And not only is it insane in the way that just what I just said, but how long does it take for that to happen? I'm never going to see another 80-year-old tree if it's removed. We'll be lucky if our grandchildren get to see that. The responsibility that we as human beings sitting here today, right, and those who'll be sitting here in the next 7 generations is to make sure that our Mother Earth is taken care of, that she's respected, that she has the wisdom and the knowledge, the respect, the love, and the humility, which is our grandfather teachings. It's how we live our lives. We all need to live our lives that way because when we understand that that tree is my relative, and if I need it, the Creator put it there. But if I take that tree, not because I need it, but because of money or greed or a misdirection or a misguided, attempt at forestry management. It is true. These trees have known what they're doing. They're connected. Their roots penetrate into our Mother Earth. They don't let go, right? They feel. Plants communicate to each other. I know that you guys know that. That one forest out west, right? It's one tree, but it's a whole forest, right? Bamboos, right? They didn't grow here, right? But surely if you use bamboo as an example, right? You look at bamboo and it's on that side of the road and all of a sudden you got bamboo growing in your yard. It's not because a seed blew over there. It's because it's traveling underground and then it comes back up. We definitely are all connected in that way. When we go in there and remove those trees, then what happens? And particularly over here in Sparta, right? As the example. So the removal of those trees with climate change is going to cause more flooding because those trees are not there to hold everything in place. And what did they just do over there also? They removed the dam. It's good that they removed that dam, but now just imagine that there's nothing to hold all that stuff in place. And all those people that live down from there, or people who drink that water, or the native trout that may be in those streams, they're going to be devastated. They're just going to literally go away. You can't have this conversation without realizing that you're a part of nature. Right? Humans don't control it, right? The burning of the forest out west. Why is it such a big issue? Because human beings decided that they were going to go cut down the trees and build their homes on the side of the mountain. And then they've already taken away part of that. And then when those trees in the forest burn and everything else, and then the torrential rain comes because of climate change, then what happens? We lose valuable lives. We lose our materialistic things, our homes, right? Our schools, the roads, the fire department, police department, services go down. This is how we as Indigenous people view all of this, right? And I want to just end by saying that it's not just my words, right? These are the words that come to me from my ancestors. These are the words that come from nearly 30,000 Native Americans who live within the confines of the state of New Jersey, who are recognized by it as their being original people. And also from our other communities, where they are today because of relocations. But lastly, it's because Governor Corzine had the foresight, right, to task the Commission on Indian Affairs, right, of New Jersey to do the 2007 report. And it is imperative that anybody in any capacity of decision-making or affecting legislation reads that report. Because when you read that report and then you read Executive Order 122, you're going to understand the other point of Chief Mann, right? That there's a legal obligation here, right? And that legal obligation is to protect our sacred places. And when you remove those trees, which are sacred to us, then what happens? Then you're violating that executive order, right? And when we include the voices of the Native people who have been left out from every conversation there has been about everything, then our perspective, when you hear it over and over, because it doesn't change, right? Our perspective is always the same. But when you're afforded the ability to hear our perspective, then your academic teachings that you've learned, right, and the science that you learned coupled with what you hear from us, right? Because we're all related too, everybody on here. I wouldn't do something that would harm you or affect you or your children or the next 7 generations from your lineage. And it's important to know that, right? We have to understand that. We have to understand why the lanternfly is here. Even though we're trying to eradicate it, even us, right? But they're here for a reason. What has taken place, what has been changed, it's not just climate change, it's human change. Somebody somewhere decided to do something that was not advantageous to us, right? And we need to understand that. We can't just willy-nilly, decide that, hey, we're just going to go and do all of this and then find out later that that ended up being the food for that woodpecker who everybody thought was extinct that showed up in New Jersey, and that's what they eat. We don't know that, right? So I want to thank you, Nishi.
Wanishi, Chief, thank you so much for taking your time to be with us and to share your perspective, an important perspective that we all need to hear. And we hope that you will continue to be a part of the conversation. And we do have a proposal that you submitted regarding, Mikey submitted regarding the ceremonial landscape stones, and we do plan to discuss that at a future meeting. So we're really glad that you're a part of this conversation. So I think with that, we're going to turn to our other speakers. Not sure who is first up.
I think, Tom, I think I'm gonna leave it up to them. It's Bob Williams, Kristen Meistrell, and Matt Olson. Whoever wants to start. Kristen, do I see you? I don't see you, Kristen.
Hello.
Hi, Bob. I can hear you. Oh, here you are, Kristen. So whoever wants to go first, that's okay with us.
Well, I'm happy to say something.
Thanks, Bob. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
I was invited to say a few words. What can you say in 5 minutes? Many of you know me. I'm a forester. And certainly have cut down a lot of trees over the last 50 years. But having been asked to sort of be on one side is not why I'm here. I'm not on either side of it. I think there has to be the beginning of an understanding that it's not a black and white thing. Human society cannot survive, nor could it ever, since the beginning of humans walking around, without the use of wood. The citizens of New Jersey, a conservative estimation, the wood consumption they require, at least 50,000 acres of forests be cleared annually somewhere on the planet. So we can't ignore that. Having said that, and having run around these forests since I was a tiny boy, I've come to understand the importance of allowing a forest to grow. And I don't think the government, particularly the state government, has done a very good job at telling us what's out there, nor do I think they know what's out there. Their forest inventories really don't tell us what is out there. The species composition, the relationship to one another, the age class structure out there. They give us a lot of numbers that are important numbers, no doubt. But when I find a grove of really old shortleaf pine that are 150 years or plus, in my mind, I envision thousands of acres of trees like that. That's what was here. That's what the forest wants to do. So the management on public land should be considering that. And if trees have to be removed, which they may, that trajectory of allowing these forests to grow for very long periods of time needs to be considered. And I just don't think it is. This idea of a rotation age is just all nonsense. Trees don't know anything about a rotation. You know, they may grow for 300 years, they may grow for 50 years, what have you. So this task force should be looking at questioning the DEP and asking these questions. What are we doing? I'm not clear on what, and many of you know me, I've been at this for many decades. I'm not clear what the forest policy of New Jersey is for public land. I'm not really clear. I'm sure there's some basic, we're for stewardship and biodiversity and all these nice things that we all say all the time. But what's that mean? Deer are certainly a problem in some places. In some places, they're not a problem. But we're not told that. We're not given, I suspect, the master plan, which we should be working on. In the meantime, there are things we need to get on with doing. And ignoring the forest is held in trust for the citizens of New Jersey. And ignoring that these citizens require wood on a massive scale is irresponsible. But I'm not suggesting we get the wood from our forest. I'm suggesting we understand that. When you go to Home Depot and you have to buy wood products from 13 or 14 different countries around the world, and you're concerned about climate change and carbon emission, that's a problem to me. So I feel very good when I do some forestry on private lands where we're supplying these needed essential wood products. But the consideration on public land really has to demand, that sustaining these forests for essentially perpetuity. And that's a complex problem. It's going to be a hard problem. And pointing fingers and yelling at people, I've seen that for decades, is never going to solve anything. And the government has to start being held accountable. And I'll give you an example. The state of New Jersey is getting ready to embark on the largest forestry operation on public land in the history of this state. And that is the Atlantic White Cedar Restoration Project. That project requires, or is intended to clear cut 10,000 acres. And that project came to fruition after many years, and I was hired as a consultant. So I know what the intent of this project is. And it's sound. It's to restore an ecosystem that we're losing. We're losing across the entire continent of North America on the East Coast. So it's a valid reason to remove trees. That wood should be utilized by our citizens in New Jersey. We should not be buying firewood from Estonia, which we do. So this is a complicated problem of how we're, what do we want from these lands and these forests? I believe we should have old trees.
Bob, you're almost done with your time.
So I see both sides. I work both sides. And we need to get on with getting a real vision here and come together and take care of our forests. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Bob. Kristen?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kristen Meistrell. I'm the Vice President of Stewardship with New Jersey Audubon. And, I'm going to echo what Bob just talked about, is that, when we think of forest stewardship, we often tend to think in black and white, and it's not. And so New Jersey Audubon backs, science-based forest stewardship planning that takes in a variety of different objectives, right? I've heard several different objectives talked about already, right? We're talking about oak regeneration, climate change, climate sequestration or carbon sequestration and carbon storage, all of those things. But there are so many other different objectives that you can be using through forest stewardship planning. I think it's really important to recognize that a forest stewardship plan is not a one size fits all. And so just as Bob talked about, is that there's some areas that we may need to do some more active management. And then there are other areas that, maybe we are able to do more passive management, but variety is the most important aspect of all of this. Now, I'm sure there's going to be, a lot of questions, and this is very, very challenging to talk about in just 5 minutes. But, we know that New Jersey as a whole has had a long history of disturbance, right? And based on the U.S. Forest Service, their FIA data, we know that, right, 80% of our forests are roughly middle-aged. And I want to be clear that when I say middle-aged, I mean that in a broad characteristic, right? So we're looking at the forest stand or the forest as a whole, that's based on scientific survey methods that are repeated on a regular basis, and that it's impossible to determine the overall age class of a forest simply by looking at the size of trees or sampling a few outliers. I know Sparta Mountain has been talked about a lot. And so, that is a great example of a forest that had been highly disturbed 100 years ago. Thomas Edison had visions for Sparta Mountain of becoming, the largest iron mine. And so it has a long history of disturbance that has happened across the state of New Jersey. And so, we are looking at forests that have been incredibly disturbed. They're roughly 80% middle-aged. They lack biodiversity, age class diversity, and structural diversity. And then they are also faced with numerous amounts of threats from disease, pests, large wildfires, storms, and all of this is a result of a rapidly changing climate. So we also recognize that, that we have both rare and common species that are declining at an alarming rate. And so that's what I'm going to focus on for the most part is that species decline. So I think many of us are aware of the article that was published in Science that we've lost 3 billion birds since the 1970s. And that article also points out that we've lost about 17% of our eastern forest birds. And because of New Jersey's geography and location, that means that New Jersey is often the stronghold for many of these species. So it is our responsibility to make sure that we are reversing this trend. So again, going back to that variety of different objectives and trying to find middle ground on how we can, best approach all of this. Now, the number one reason behind species decline is habitat loss. And most people think of habitat loss as being land conversion, which is 100% true. So forests being converted to development, or even forests being converted to agriculture or other types of land use. But we are also talking about habitat condition, right? So our forests are constantly changing. And habitat condition is a very important factor that we have to consider when we think about this. I go back to the 80% of our forests as being middle-aged. And that means that we don't have the highest diversity of different types of forests in New Jersey. And that also means that we are not supporting the highest number of species overall, right? A lot of times we have a narrow image of what a forest should look like, but in reality, forests can come in so many different types of forms. So then if, we go back to the data and, I'll reiterate what Bob said, that, these are just numbers and we need to be able to really start to look into this even more. But if we go back to the data, a lot of the acres of forest land, so just forest land in New Jersey, has remained relatively constant since the 1980s. And, that is thanks to all of the tireless effort that many of you have put into this on this call. But right, we're still losing species at an alarming rate. And so the answer starts to become a little bit clearer when we start to look at that habitat condition. Now, there's also invasive species, forest pests, all deer overbrowse that are contributing to this. But if we also take another aspect of this, right, if we look at young forest habitat, the decline is much more staggering than just regular, the actual acres of forest. And then there is actually a correlation between the decline of several bird species and the decline in young forest habitat. And I am not just talking about golden-winged warbler. I'm also talking about several different bird species: prairie warbler, wood thrush, eastern towhee, all just examples of species that have had significant declines. Part of this is because there's a correlation between species needing different types of habitat throughout its life cycle. There are numerous studies that talk about interior forest nesting birds like the wood thrush that need that mature forest to be able to breed, but then they also need that young forest habitat for forage. And that makes a lot of sense because, these young forests, that's where the food source is. Caterpillars and insects make up a huge portion of forage for many bird species, and that is especially true during the breeding and fledgling season. And if we look at tree species that are host plants for the highest number of Lepidoptera species, so butterflies and moths, we see a pretty significant trend, right? Oaks are number one in that they, I think in New Jersey, they support over 500 species, and nationwide it might be close to 1,000. And then the next top producers are cherry, birch, willow, and aspens, all species that require abundant light to regenerate, aka young forest habitat. And so there's numerous studies that show that species need different types of habitat. So really, again, I'm going to go back to the first thing I mentioned, which is a variety of different goals, objectives, habitats. We need to be able to use all of the tools that we have in our toolbox to make some of this work happen. Now, I will also then point out that there are many,
almost done.
Okay, there are many ecological reasons why we may need to remove wood from a forest, and Atlantic white cedar restoration is a perfect example. And so unless we can all agree to stop using wood products, a second benefit can be using that revenue to generate, to reinvest back into the habitat restoration project. And this is really important because this work is incredibly expensive to conduct. So, so trying to look at the cycle as a whole, making sure that we are looking at diversity, diverse strategies to be able to accomplish this work, diverse habitats to sustain and protect our forests, and a diverse mosaic of different types of forest habitat to sustain both common and rare species.
Thank you, Kristen. And Bob, I don't remember if I said thank you to you, so thank you, Bob. And last speaker, Matt. Oh, wait. You can unmute yourself now, Matt.
Okay, you can hear me now, though.
Yes.
Good. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to get my timer started here so I can try to keep it on 5 minutes. So I guess I'm just going to build on some of what Bob had just said, and especially with what Kristen had just said. So there's quite a bit of stuff there that I think are really important points and things that actually I've prepared to talk about, but I won't have to speak about quite as much. But I think I'll kind of start with a general statement. Kind of just being a part of this group at this point, I think all or most of us would agree with the statement that New Jersey's public forest should be managed for ecological values. And I think that's kind of the overriding focus in a lot of ways. That's kind of what I get from our conversations. So when I say ecological values, biodiversity conservation, forest health, we could think about recreational values as well that might go along with that. But for me, kind of secondarily, I see timber production as something that our public land also should be able to support to some degree. It is an essential ecosystem service. Bob points this out, that we are wood-dependent species, and that's not changing anytime soon. But I will also say that, to my knowledge, from my experience in New Jersey and speaking with folks, our state forests are largely managed for ecological value. So any idea that our forests are being cut down for wood products and basically bending to forest products industries or timber harvesters, I think is just entirely untrue. But what I will say is that cutting trees can be used for conservation, as well as removing trees can be used for conservation. So what I mean by this is that when we practice silviculture, really a lot of our silvicultural methods are predicated on a forestry operation where we're manipulating canopy structure, we're removing trees from the woods. That's basically creating the light environment that we know is going to regenerate certain species. We can modify the light environment and the stand structure as basically a way to try to regenerate desired species. There's over a century of silviculture to support that statement, and that would especially apply in the case of oaks. We've learned a lot about oaks to this point where, and I don't want to take Emile on directly with this, but the thing is, fencing to protect against deer, controlling invasive plant species, I don't think that that's going to be enough to regenerate oak. Now, I know you did put a provision in there to enrichment plant. In fact, I'm all for the idea of like doing that kind of work in natural gaps. I think that's a fantastic idea. I would just challenge that I think we need to do more to ensure that we have basically a viable oak population on many of our state lands, particularly in North Jersey, where it looks like it's a species or a group of species that could really benefit us in really combating climate change and trying to increase adaptive capacity and resilience in our forests. You know, my one challenge, I guess, also to the idea of relying on natural disturbances to create the gaps that we can go in and kind of work with, you know, basically as a form of natural disturbance, is that we have very little control over that. So culturally, we can go into a stand and we can create the basically narrow range of light conditions that we know can regenerate oak. Now we need to do that in combination with protecting against deer and invasive plant control, probably also native plant management, may need to think about enrichment planting. Bottom line is research supports that we can do this successfully. I know that there are a lot of failures and you could point to lots of failures, but there's also tons of successes and we know how to do it. It's just a matter of cost. So that's kind of where I get into the idea of removing trees from some of these sites. If we're going to be practicing silviculture, we're going to be removing larger overstory trees. If we can do that through some type of a timber sale, then the revenues, the proceeds from those timber sales could be earmarked for conservation back in that same area that can ensure reforestation of desired species happens. That could be used to protect against deer, that money could be used to build fences, that money could be used to control invasive plant species, right? So we can invest that money back in. Rather, because we're talking, especially with deer fencing and other things, these are out-of-pocket costs. Like we need help to cover those costs. One way to do that is through timber sale proceeds. But in the least, being able to do some type of stewardship contract where there's a timber for services exchange. At least we can get some of the silviculture done, and then we'd have to invest more for, you know, other types of protections and reforestation and such. So I guess, you know, one thing I do want to mention as well, and this gets onto the climate issue. So, you know, we're talking about climate change and we're kind of talking about this idea that we want to, in some cases, focus on the mitigation benefits that a forest could provide, where we're just trying to soak up as much carbon in our forest as we can. The assumption that goes into that, however, is that you have a healthy forest that's functioning and can provide that benefit. If you look at vulnerability assessments for New Jersey and other parts of the mid-Atlantic region, particularly northern New Jersey, it does show that there are some vulnerabilities in our forest based on its current state. That the species composition of a lot of our forests, particularly in northern New Jersey, are such that the species are not physiologically well adapted to projected future climate. Natural succession in those forests with deer presence is basically taking us even further away, perhaps, from something that would be considered a resilient state. We can practice silviculture in a way where we can actually direct succession to a better adapted condition in the future. And the science backs that, and we 100% can get that done. I'm not saying it has to be done everywhere, but maybe over some portion of our state land areas. And that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Matt, so much for keeping the time. So I guess we're going into clarifying questions now. And after clarifying questions, we're going to open it up for discussions of maybe somebody that hasn't, you know, expressed their point, that it might be completely different to what we have heard so far. But why don't we just start with Eileen? Eileen, please.
Okay, yeah, I do have a question, but just to elaborate, this will continue into tomorrow too. So there are opportunities. We really wanted to give this a lot of time. I actually had a qualifying question for Kristen and Bob, because both of you mentioned Atlantic white cedar. Actually, so did Emile. And you said specifically what I heard was that it's an example when removing wood might be ecologically necessary, but I don't understand how that is. Could you elaborate, maybe Kristen go first and Bob, on how in that case and maybe other cases where removing the wood may be ecologically necessary?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. I think, so overall, right, there are a lot of different reasons for removing wood products from an area. And this is to go back to the fact that what do seedlings and most, a lot of tree species need? They need space and sunlight to be able to regenerate. And if you think about, right, so if you take all of the Atlantic white cedar that may need to come down in an area, or as Emile talked about, the pine forest that, the blueberry forest at Hovnanian Sanctuary that regrew into pine and then was converted into an Atlantic white cedar. If we had left all of that material there, or even wood chipped it, nothing would be able to survive. And that is because, of the biology of the tree species. And so, right, there's this then secondary benefit of you have to remove the material in order for regeneration to occur. And so when you remove all of that wood, what do you do with it? And so a secondary benefit can be to use it for wood products, which then can help generate funds to go back into the restoration and, and potentially help fund things like a deer fence, right? I'll give you an example. We fenced in an area about 17 acres recently, and that deer fence cost $45,000 to install. That is an insane amount of money, and it requires constant maintenance and constant observation. So that's just one example. Another one that I am deeply familiar with is bog turtle habitat. And so oftentimes this is sort of happening separately from forest stewardship, but sometimes it can be included. But, it's another example of, if you leave the material there, right? Bog turtles, they are reptiles that need plenty of sunlight to be able to survive. And they also need a very specific habitat type and vegetation structure to be able to maintain their life cycle. If you were to remove the species, the trees or the shrubs from that area and let it all lie there, there would not be any room for regeneration. There would not be any room for the species to use that habitat properly. And then even if you take that and turn it into brush piles, then you start to run into issues of predation and attracting predators. So there are, that's just two examples of times when you would need to remove that wood from an area to be able to sustain ecological habitat.
Thanks, Kristen. Bob, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, it's far more complicated than that. I can tell you that. Cedar has been exploited for centuries, and of course, it is a prime example of cut and run. Cut it, leave, cut it. Sometimes it came back, most of the time it didn't. So today we have these forests that are now occupying those sites that are basically maturing maple, gum, and pitch pine. They're the three main. There's a few others, but they're the main ones. They have to be removed in order to get the full sunlight that if there's an existing seed bank or if we have to plant trees to optimize the success of the growth or regeneration of cedar. Now, you go into one of those forests and you start dropping trees, in about an hour, you're going to start scratching your head and say, what are we going to do with all this? Because that's not, you can't leave the land like that. But a couple things are important. One is the removal of those trees actually provides the needed scarification of that duff layer. If you don't scarify the litter layer that these trees have established, that seed is not going to germinate. Number two, if you don't remove it, you've just left an unbelievable fire hazard. And the importance of mitigating that particular fire hazard is that if a fire gets in there, it's not only going to release all this carbon emission, which is off the charts, it's going to turf and destroy the very seed bank of those organic soils that are accumulating carbon for literally thousands of years and prohibit what you're trying to do to get this cedar back. So that material has to be moved. The cost to do that is astronomical. Many times, that material can offset that cost, even if it's a barter. you give them the wood to, if they can take it and then process for something. If in fact, because the state's project is so enormous, that wood has value, the state should be compensated for that. And in fact, sure, they have a $19 million grant to pay for all this, but that doesn't mean you give the wood away if there's a market. Right now, there is no market. We need a market. So getting your wood products from really important forest restoration efforts seems to me the way to drive forestry, to push it in that direction. In addition to the wood that has to come off for the cedar, it would be silly then not to manage the adjacent pine forest to mitigate the fire hazard that's going to come from that and destroy all your work. So there's more wood that has to be processed. And there's no way the taxpayers are ever going to be able to pay for the restoration of some of these forests. Wood products are the answer. I don't think the DEP understands that. I think they're paranoid of a piece of wood coming off their land. They have to get over that. And of course, we all have to come to terms with when is it appropriate to remove trees? The Atlantic white cedar is just one example. There are others. And I will say again, even in that project, there are areas where being on that team, I've said that, you know, you're not going to cut trees there, because if you do, I'll chain myself to those trees and protest. You know, it depends. It depends on what we're seeing out there on the landscape. But that's one of the best examples of bringing the environment with the economy and satisfying everything we need. It's a win-win. If society believes that it's important to restore this, quote, globally threatened, critically imperiled ecosystem, which I believe it is, and I've tried for 30 years to get someone to do something, and of course they haven't done anything, but now they have the money, so their bluff is called. You know, are they going to go out to Wharton Forest as we've selected? That project was done on a landscape level. We looked at southern New Jersey, and those areas were selected because they offer the optimum chances of success. And they also are on the urban agricultural front of the pine lands, where these invasive plants are moving into the pine lands. And my position was, this is the place to stop them. And if we're going to stop them, do all this work, why not bring the cedar back? So when you look at all the components of what a really important project is, you know, it just makes sense ecologically. And then of course, these things are extremely expensive. And I'll just say it again, I'll say it every day of the week. We are a wood dependent species. Every single person woke up this morning, they don't realize it, but they need wood 24/7. Every movement of their life, wood is involved. And I could go on and on about all the wood products that we use every day. And I have a thing about this now. It's very extremely concerning to me that our big box stores are buying all their wood products from overseas. We you know, North America is the wood basket of the world. We should be leading the way in sustainability and protecting the environment and restoring our forests, to move the forest industry away from production forestry, plantation forestry. And we in New Jersey could be the spearhead of that, of sending that message out across the forestry community, forest industry, as opposed to a logger is a bad person and we got to get rid of him, whatever it takes. The loggers provide us everything we need every day of the week, and they want to protect the forest as much as we do because they're generational families. They want their kids and their grandkids and everybody to have a job in the future too. You know, let's get this straight. Are there bad players? Yeah.
Sorry, it's just in the interest of time, so we have a lot of questions. But thank you so much. Laura, you're next. Sorry, Bob.
I have a question for Leslie. Maybe Sarah might have said something about this too, but on the subject of, she made a comment in passing, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so tell me if I got it wrong, but that like if you there was a time when you could cut down a tree and it would improve the prospects of growth of other trees, but that isn't true anymore. Could you explain that a little bit? Was
that for Leslie, Laura?
Pardon?
Was that for Leslie?
Yes, Leslie's the one who said it, but I think Sarah probably also has I don't know.
Leslie, you can unmute there you go.
Yeah, when I was a kid, because the landscape, we had very few deer. We got excited if we saw them, and there were very few invasives. Honeysuckle was probably the first one to appear and kind of raise my eye, make me start worrying about invasive species. So it was very different. You could cut a big tree and get a little tree, but that's not the way it is anymore. And I'm amazed at how climate change does not come up very often. The loss of these big trees in terms of climate is something that has to be considered in a very, very big way, as well as how to maintain that as sequestered carbon. If you could tell me everything became a wood product and was sequestered in wood immediately, I'd be thrilled. But I'd love to see what's happening to that wood. That I really support white cedar, but I'm not convinced that this is the only way to do it.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Nick, you're next. You can unmute yourself. Nick? You're not on mute, so I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My question would be, after you make egress and regress into a forest with your heavy machinery and you get whatever trees that you can find, what money could possibly be left from lumber sales after the workforce is paid? I mean, it can't be any significant amount. And please tell me that plastic hasn't replaced wood. And if you're talking about old wood, but we seem to be saying we have to keep a windmill going, we have to keep taking wood from our remaining biospheres that we have. Our only one of the cheapest and efficient ways to sequester carbon is trees. And when they say, oh, we can't put all our eggs in one basket, we are in one basket. We're all on this planet. We're facing a dilemma of climate change induced by humans, not only taking trees, but taking the oil and the coal of all the previous sequestered carbon, and we're throwing it back in the atmosphere. We're taking billions of years and we're throwing it back in cosmic seconds. And we're just going to throw wood on the pile. The background of this whole thing is supposed to be climate change and not taking wood out of our remaining forest, public forest. So if he can answer the question, is how much money could possibly be generated
After the workforce. Right?
say,
Oh, you muted yourself. I think the question is, right, Andy? Andy, you're nodding your head. After the workforce. So whoever wants to take that question.
Yeah, thanks. So, I'm gonna try, I'll try and I think there's two things to look at here, right? So the first one is I do want to point out, just because I've heard these terms used interchangeably, that carbon sequestration and carbon storage are often used in the same light, but they are different, right? So carbon sequestration is the rate at which carbon is taken from the atmosphere, and carbon storage is what is actually storing. And so, there has been actually many studies, including one out of Rutgers University that looked at trees and saw that carbon sequestration does actually kind of cap out at about age 70. Now that is again different from our carbon storage. And so I just first wanted to point that out, just because I can see that there's a lot of discussion about that. The other thing is now, and I'm going to use Sparta Mountain again as an example, and this is all public information. You can find this right on their website. But Sparta Mountain, the amount of wood products that were taken off of Sparta Mountain and sold generated roughly $11,400, right? So that is since 2011 when the work began. So more than 11 years, there has been $11,000 generated. On the flip side, the cost to implement the work has been roughly $60,000, and that does not include the cost of the DEP staff to plan, implement, oversee, monitor, and maintain all of this work. So, so I think that answers your question, is that there isn't a lot of money left over, but what ends up happening is that $11,000 can then help offset some of that $60,000+ that is needed to be able to to get the work done. These projects are as I mentioned, are incredibly expensive. There is some of the quotes that we've gotten are $3,500 per acre just to do some of this work. And I mentioned the deer fencing. That's another high ticket item. So if we want to be able to restore and maintain our forests, we have to figure out how to pay for it. And I think that those numbers show too that this isn't about generating funds. It barely even helps bring the project to net zero.
Thank you, Kristen. Tom, you're next.
Yeah, just on that point, I've been struck by a number of the speakers talking about the need to generate funds. And I just wanted to remind everyone that this task force has considered numerous proposals, right, to identify alternate funding sources. And so I wonder if any of the speakers, have thoughts on that issue, right? It's not the only way to generate revenues. And then the second thing that's really running through my head is, and Bob Williams mentioned sort of a project that was really done from a landscape perspective. And I'm just also wondering if any of the speakers have thoughts on, to what degree is that happening? To what degree do we have enough information to really look at our forests at a landscape level to kind of understand and think about what makes sense where? And I hear a lot of focus on species of wildlife that need young forests and openings, but I know there are also species of wildlife that depend on interior forests, right? And New Jersey is a very fragmented, landscape, I think, compared to a lot of other states, right? We've got a lot of people, we've got a lot of roads, and transmission lines and all kinds of things that cut through our forests. And do we really understand, where are New Jersey's interior forests, and what is the status of the species that depend on those forests? Do we have enough information to really understand the big picture to make some of these individual decisions within that context? So
thanks, Tom. Who wants to take that question?
Emile is waving his hand.
Okay, where are you, Emile? I don't know why I don't see people. Oh, here you are.
Okay,
Go ahead,
so
Emile.
yes, thank you. So I got about 5 things I want to say. I don't know which order they're going to come out in. Certainly, we need to do landscape level planning. I support the Atlantic White Cedar project because it's an ecosystem that's disappearing, right? A critical keystone ecosystem with all sorts of species in it that don't live in any other ecosystem. And whatever we can do, and if it means the only way to do it, and I would defer to Bob Williams on something like Atlantic white cedar restoration. If it means removing pine and maple and finding a way that, you know, you have to either burn it or take it off site or do something, I would defer to him on that, because that's an ecosystem that we're losing. That, you know, it's virtually, and New Jersey is the stronghold for Atlantic white cedar. It's almost gone, right, from the entire East Coast. So New Jersey's the place to do it. That's a critical issue. And that would be an exception, right? That would be an exception to the idea that we shouldn't be selling wood products just for the sake of there's something valuable in that forest. The idea that we should be managing for prairie warblers and rufous-sided towhees in northern New Jersey is absolutely ridiculous, okay? Prairie warblers and rufous-sided towhees, the stronghold in New Jersey is the pine barrens, and we can use prescribed burning and thinning from the ground up and leaving the material in the forest and prescribed burning in the uplands, as the state has been trying to do in the last number of years. And also the way they managed the recent wildfire by just going around the edges and setting backfires and letting that fire burn. They could have tried to put it out at 2,000 or 3,000 acres, but they didn't. They were smart and they let it burn like 12 or 13,000 acres. That's all going to become incredible prairie warbler and rufous-sided towhee habitat. The idea that we should be cutting up interior forests in northern New Jersey to make habitats for species like rufous-sided towhees and prairie warblers is completely wrong. That's the wrong place to do it. It was a good idea to try for golden wing warblers, but climate change is pushing them north. Maybe there could be projects for cerulean warblers and bog turtles in northern New Jersey, which would be small projects, gap-dependent projects, and maybe there would be some sort of an exception for a couple of projects like that. But the idea that we should be managing for species in the wrong place is just wrong. And I will not let the Fish and Wildlife agencies tell me that we should be managing for indigo buntings and rufous-sided towhees in interior forests. It doesn't make any sense. And prairie warblers and a host of other species that have been added to the list of special concern species and species at risk and all sorts of other lists, simply to promote the idea that young forests should be everywhere. The other concept, Tom, about the money, I'm sorry, Tom, you just asked about money.
Other revenue sources. We
The
can
other
include our
revenue,
sources.
you know, why aren't we doing something about deer? I'm going to submit my proposals about deer before the deadline on the 31st. It's absolutely ridiculous that we should be talking about having to put up fences for deer that cost $45,000 or, you know, whatever they cost. They're incredibly expensive, right? Even if you want to put up a little fence around a bog turtle gap that you make, or whatever it might be, it would be incredibly expensive. And yet our state does nothing about trying to reduce the deer in the pinelands and in the highlands. The targets are to keep them the same, and even in the past couple of decades to even increase the deer populations in those areas, which is a travesty, okay? We need to reduce the deer tenfold. And then we would have to stop spending money on things in order to combat the problem that's staring us right in the face, all right? So, you know, there are so many, and we can't keep talking about the Pine Barrens and North Jersey in the same webinar. You know, the Atlantic white cedar issue in the pines and creating fire breaks and making sure that we don't have fires going, you know, we create all this magnificent cedar and then 20 years from now, we let fires burn it up. Those are all really important things that Bob Williams has said, and we have to come up with solutions for all of that. But North Jersey is completely different, and I want to encourage everyone to think about what Leslie Sauer said, is really come up with a reason to take that stuff off site. If you need to girdle a tree, fell a tree, create habitats for specific species that should be in the forests of North Jersey, then let's do it. And let's, as only when it's the last possible option, remove the material from the site. And for the most part, let's let those North Jersey forests actually get old. They're not middle-aged. Most of them are still young. This idea that an 80-year-old forest is middle-aged is just silly. a middle-aged forest. You know, that's from a silvicultural point of view. An 80-year-old forest is young. Those trees are going to continue. And the Massachusetts study that came out about the same time as the Rick Lathrop study, which showed that those trees are sequestering carbon at ages of 100 and 120 and 140 years faster than they've ever sequestered carbon before. The rate, it's still going up, and they're going to do it for another 50 to 100 years, if not more. The idea that a tree is slowing down on its carbon sequestration at age 80 is completely wrong. I don't agree with it. I don't think the science agrees with it, and we have the science to back it up. Thanks.
Thanks, Emile. Emile, you keep referring to Bob. I'm wondering if Bob wants to say anything about this, or maybe Kristen, if you want to respond to Tom's question.
Yeah, I kept myself on mute so I wouldn't have to keep, you wouldn't have to keep finding us, but I don't know if that's the right approach.
That helps, Kristen. Thank you.
Okay, there's a lot of things to kind of work through on both what Tom, the questions that Tom had posed, but also to kind of respond to Emile, right? I think that to go back to Tom's question, the landscape level planning is absolutely necessary, and I think that that any scientist who says that they know everything and that they have all the answers is lying, because every day we are learning new pieces of information, trying to gather as much information and understand where we are overall. So I think that we need to make sure that we are looking at the landscape as a whole. Now, I think, I think that in terms of managing forests for interior bird species versus young forest species, I think, again, I'm going to go back to my point of many species, regardless of where they're breeding, right? And oftentimes when we say interior bird species, we're talking about birds that breed in the interior forest. That is not the only habitat that they need, right? So just like people, they have a variety of different needs throughout their life cycle. And this isn't just true for birds, it's true for almost every single wildlife species. Now, of course, there are species that are more generalists that can tolerate different levels of habitat type, but there are ones that have very, very narrow requirements and very specific requirements. So I will go back. There are several studies that have taken a look at interior nesting birds, right? And these are wood thrush, hermit thrush, and this is in the Northeast, but taking a look at, I know I have the list here, but yellow rump warbler, ovenbird, red-eyed vireo, several other species that are species that nest in the interior. What ends up happening is that they need those early young forests for forage, and there's a lot of studies, a lot of science that says just that describes just that. So those interior forest birds, they need the interior forest for nesting, but then they need young forest that is nearby for foraging. The same goes for golden wing warbler, right? So golden wing warbler, typically they need that early successional young forest habitat for breeding, but they still need, more mature forests at some point during their life cycle. And so, so when we are talking about landscape level planning, the idea is to create that mosaic of habitat, right? We are not suggesting to cut down all 80 to 100-year-old trees. That is not what would benefit anything. What we're looking at is trying to create that mosaic of habitat. So you have patches of young forests that are nearby, patches of, older mature forests that are nearby, middle-aged forests, and that you have that mosaic. Also, the narrative that says that's fragmentation is not true, because fragmentation is when you're looking at forest that is then converted or is nearby something that is not a forest. And so things like all of our homes, right, that created fragmentation. Roads, that creates fragmentation. Things that can never then be regenerated into a forest, that is what creates that fragmentation of the landscape. So, it's important to think about the landscape, as a whole. And, quite frankly, I'm going to speak directly to what Emile said about not managing for some of our more common species. I'm going to disagree with that because, we are seeing common species decline at a rapid pace, an incredibly rapid pace. And New Jersey is the stronghold for a lot of those species. And so if we are just focusing on our rare and imperiled species, that's important, but we have to be thinking about our common species as well. And then, yep,
Sorry, Kristen.
good. Yeah, I'll let Bob speak then, I think more towards some of the things that Emile was talking about.
Thank you, Kristen. I just want to say, everybody, we only have 5 more minutes. So as the last 2 meetings, we're going to keep it open for the discussion and questions. So just so you know, Bob.
Well, as I've gotten older and I've spent more and more time in the forest, I absolutely want to see more older trees. And I've never heard a policy come out of the DEP who has the responsibility of taking care of our forests about that. If I had more time, I would explain what I mean. So it's interesting how I go to a lot of forests and I'm told a lot of things, and I go there and the forest is doing quite well. Too many times foresters want to cut some trees and it's about a healthy forest, and it depends. Now, I'll make the statement that I think is true. I don't think there's a forester in New Jersey who has cut more trees than me in the last 30 years. It's not possible. So I have a little bit of understanding what I'm talking about, but I love old trees and I want to see whole forests of pitch pines and shortleaf pine that are 250 years old. I won't see them, but somebody will. We're looking at our forests today in the 21st century, and for the first time in several centuries, there's some big old trees. That's actually a new phenomenon. When I was a boy and my father would take me out into pine lands to go hunting, he was raised from the 1920 on. He would tell me there were no big trees. And here I am all these decades later, and I'm stumbling upon some really magnificent, beautiful old trees. Not many, but it demonstrates that that's what the land wants to support. And how we integrate these biological issues to get that is not easy. It's not easy. How much land should be designated as reserve to be left to grow for 250 years? I don't know. And no one's out there trying to figure that out to be able to come to some task force like this to say, look, I want to give you information that you might be able to come to a consensus on a balance of what we want from these lands. I don't hear it. No one talks to me about it, but I do it every day. I have over 1,000 clients. I'm on the landscape in a big way every day, and I think about those things. And I just am somewhat saddened or disappointed that no one seems to get that. We need to the government needs to tell me and start understanding what do they own, and not just in terms of acres, what's out there. I don't need to see an FIA data sheet to tell me the trees. I see a bell curve, and the whole perspective of how we're going to manage it is based on this bell curve. That's silly. That bell curve doesn't tell me what I need to know. And as far as wood products, I have to say one thing. We're wasting, when you have 500 acres of dead cedar trees that are worth literally millions of dollars, And you'd rather let them rot and release their carbon into the atmosphere instead of salvaging those trees and regenerating that forest, possibly. That's just stupid. And it's not a negative thing that the trees actually generated millions of dollars. Same with the ash in Stokes Forest. That dead ash is probably worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions. Now it's rotting, releasing all of its carbon into the atmosphere. That seems silly to me. But if there's a biological reason why we need 500 acres of standing dead cedar, a biologist or a botanist or somebody could help me understand that. I don't get it. So we've got a lot of work to do, folks. And whether this task force is the mechanism that'll get us there, I don't know. I appreciate what you're doing. I'm not really participating. I listen to the chatter and I appreciate what everybody's doing. But I'm in an age and where I am in life where I'm about working out in the forest. I got to get things done.
We got to move on, Bob. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
Appreciate you
Tom.
sharing all your views, but we're at the 6 o'clock here and we need to wrap up. I want to suggest, we got a lot of people with their hands up and I want to make sure we capture everyone's questions. And this conversation is going to continue tomorrow. It's basically a 2-part conversation. So maybe we could have everyone who has your hand up that hasn't been able to ask your question today, send your question to Allison, or you could send it to any one of the co-chairs. We'll record them all and we can pick up some of these questions tomorrow. So I would ask everyone to do that. And then fellow co-chairs, what do we need to wrap up here for today?
I think we were going to go over the organizational representation as we finished with that. Did you want to go over that quickly? In the event of voting, which we may do, we may have a voting session in the future. We wanted to be sure that we had any organization that wanted to be represented to let us know who their designated representative is for voting. So people have had months and months to do that. So we're not accepting any more letters because we have to stop it at some point. We stopped it before, but we opened it up again because we really wanted anybody who wanted to have an organizational representative to have one. So it's now closed, but we do have a list of everyone who did send letters. So I think we mentioned last time that the way it was going to be, individuals and for-profit companies would get a vote, and then the rest would be determined by size, and that they would be weighted in some way. So we explored a lot of options. We explored a lot of what other people do when they do organizational representational votes. So what we came up with first for government entities, like an environmental commission, small, medium, and large, easy, 3 designations. A municipality, a locality would get, be weighed 2. We figured we'll double it from a 1 for, an individual or a for-profit, from 1 to 2, we're just going to double it. Same with medium, a county or a regional government, we'll double that again. That'll be 4. It'll be counted as a 4. So Ocean County Parks would have a weighted vote of 4. And then any statewide, and for government, I don't think we have any, but a statewide government entity would be doubled, 8. So we have 1, 2, 4, and 8. For organizations, again, similarly, we kept it at 3, small, medium, and large. Small organizations are those under 100 members or staff, and they would get a count of 2. The medium-sized organizations, which are more than 100 but less than 1,000, would have a weight of 4. And again, large sized organizations of greater than 1,000 would, again, doubling at 8. So using that same system that we thought, any system we felt was arbitrary in some way, but we did agree that this doubling kind of, it gave the larger organizations a little bit more, but not too much more. So 1, 2, 4, and 8. We do have a table that we're going to share with folks on what the organizations are, who their representatives are, and then what their voting rank is. And we're going to send that out to everyone because, you know, we want to be transparent. But because we're releasing all of this information out now, we're not accepting more. So this is the final list of organizations. And I didn't count them up. I should have. How many there are. I would say there's 26 or so. There are about 26 organizations that are represented on this task force. And then, as you know, several hundred individuals. So that's how we're going to be doing the voting. Should we come to voting? So are we taking any questions about that today? Oh, someone has a question about individuals. So there are individuals who work at, I'm going to use New Jersey Audubon. Kristen Meistrell from New Jersey Audubon, Alex Ireland. We have a couple of people who participate, but there is one who's the designated representative for New Jersey Audubon. So only that designated person would have a vote. The others would count as 0. However, my mother is a member, just a member of New Jersey Audubon. She's, you know, sends them $15. She's not affiliated in any way. If she were on this task force, she would be representing herself and she would have a vote. So, you know, just to clarify it again, a person who's simply on the task force for their own interest, I'm a homeowner in an area, I'm concerned, I'm a concerned individual, you have a vote, you have that one. It's the organizations where it's different. You can't have five staff people from your organization all having a vote. It's your one representative at that weighted vote. Okay. Well, if you're not part of any organization, you're representing yourself. I'm seeing a couple of questions, so you get a vote. Can we take other questions specifically on this, or do you want to wait until tomorrow? Andy, Tom, or Anjali?
I'm okay. Up to you.
A few minutes, I think.
Yeah. So if you have a question about that, I know I wrote down everybody's name who had their hand up. And we're going to continue those questions for tomorrow. So for right now, we'll take any logistical questions, not comments, just we took a lot of time to come up with this, and anybody doing this might have done it differently, but this is where we landed. But we're happy to explain, like clarifying questions. Okay, so Julia, you have a clarifying question? Oh, your hand is up. I'm sorry. Let's lower. I'm going to lower all the hands.
My hand is up for tomorrow.
Okay, and I have you down. You are number 2 on the list, Julia.
Right, but my hand was not up for the voting.
Okay, I'm going to lower all the hands for right now, just because I wrote them down. So you are going to be reflected. And then anyone who has a question about this, about the voting or the organizations, now would be the time to raise your hand. Okay, we did talk about it a couple of times. Okay, Nicholas Homyak, you have a question.
How do we keep the circle from being penetrated? In other words, I'm a member of the New Jersey Forestry Association, but I'm going to count myself also as an individual. Is there a catch-all for a form of cheating for a double vote?
So you actually have 2 questions there. One is like, you are a member of an association, but you're representing yourself here. You're not employed by them. You're not on their board. So we wouldn't say they're representing you. They're not. You're representing yourself, so you will have a vote. Your second question is, how do we prevent somebody from just saying, hurry up, go and vote my way, and hundreds of people? We're going to use some software, and it's linked to your email address specifically. So that email can vote one time and it can't be shared. So we are going to use some software that controls for that.
No, the question though was, I'm an individual, but I'm also in the organization.
Mhm.
So I'm going to vote with the organization, and then I'm going to vote again. I'm an actual member of the organization. I'm not a contributor. I'm a member.
If you're,
I'm a sitting
are you a
board member
staff
of
person?
an organization.
New Jersey
Say
Forest,
again?
we have New Jersey Forestry Association. You're not listed on it as like a staff person or a board member. Nicholas, we wouldn't.
All right, so you do have a list, okay.
Yeah, yeah. So we wouldn't want them to vote on your behalf if you're not part of that. You have your own vote. Your own vote.
I just want to make sure that the circle doesn't get broken for a double
Yeah,
vote.
there's a lot. Yeah, there's a
extra
lot of
votes.
there's a lot of possibilities for that. So we are controlling for that. All right, so I'm going to take the next question is Leslie Sauer.
Yes, one question I have is when did this second round happen? Like my environmental commission would have signed up if we'd known there was a second round of sign up. And was it all like environmental commissions in counties?
It was anyone. It was
2018?
open from February through now. There wasn't a round, it was just rolling. It was open. It was always open. And it was anyone, it was the
But you said
charge.
there was a second round. I mean,
No, at one point we were going to say no more, but then we changed our minds because there were other organizations that needed to get their board approval. It took more time.
okay.
So we just let it go. It never really was closed, but it
But
was
that
open
was-
to everyone. It was
That
open.
was just for the letter, Eileen. That was just for the letter. I think Leslie's
letter.
just thinking of more organizations or people joining. That was
Yeah,
just.
so
the
no more
letter.
organizations
So
anymore.
what- if you signed up in the beginning, that's it.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay,
as of now,
authorization
we've gotten
might have taken longer.
we've gotten letters as of yesterday. I mean, there's.
Yeah,
letters
but
that have
to
come in.
clarify, we stopped letting new people onto the task force.
Right.
So it was closed to new
Right.
members. Those members of the task force could then let us know what organization they were representing up until yesterday. Yes.
And is
Or
there
whenever.
any,
Right.
do we have any way of knowing who's actually been participating and listening to all this stuff? I'm just curious, how many people are going to vote, and never ever see anything, or is there any way to correlate any of that?
Oh, you mean a list of all the participants?
Right.
Yeah, we're looking into when I've done task forces before, they're public, they're open, they're experts. This is a little different at stakeholders. So I'm going to take a look at, how the government, because some people, if somebody wants to be private, if they don't want their name, I'm not sure if we're going to be comfortable listing everybody's name. We're
Right.
looking into that. Organizations for sure. In
Right.
fact, we're going to send everyone this list of organizations and their authorized representatives. You'll get a copy of that. It's
Thank
just the individuals,
Oh,
we're-
I know, there's some who have totally unrecognizable signups, so.
yeah. So,
whether
well,
they
I don't know
can
if you remember,
contact or not.
if you only had an email address and no name associated with it, we contacted you because if it's just an email, like we don't know who you are or what you are. So that will be one of the criteria is that if you don't have a name associated with your email address,
Oh, that will help a lot.
yeah,
That was a core question for
Yeah.
me. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Doug Meckel?
Yes, just quick logistics question. I've been coming to all these since the beginning, and my loved one has been with me because we've been sharing a Zoom. So when it comes voting time, we need separate sign-ins, I assume?
Yeah, I think you have two
Susan.
different, yeah.
Yes,
You're
Susan.
two separate individuals.
Yes, right. So we were looking at that,
No.
and I emailed you guys because I wasn't getting the emails, but hopefully that will be corrected in the future.
Yeah. So you will each have your own login for voting.
Okay, Swati. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Julia.
There you go.
Great. I want to just clear something up. When we talked about the Norwood Environmental Commission, and because the Norwood Environmental Commission had voted their chairman to represent them, but their chairman or person works for the New Jersey Highlands Coalition. And you said that the Norwood Environmental Commission could still vote, but she cannot. Well, the Norwood Environmental Commission, you're going to have to allow that person to
Oh, yeah.
become.
They did.
They've already
identified-
signed up.
They identified another person.
Yes, I know they did.
Oh, there he
But-
is. He
but-
just
but-
pointed.
But they weren't here originally. So I just wanted to make sure that they made
Oh, I
it.
see what you're saying. So
under-
Phil will need to, chat with his colleagues on the commission when and if the time comes to vote. He's representing them, so he'll need to bring it back to them for when he
Right.
votes.
Okay, thank you.
And Ken Dolsky?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to bring up a question that hasn't really been discussed so far, but I am strongly in favor of having the voting be transparent and that we all get to see how everybody votes. That does not be a secret ballot.
No, it will be anonymous, and we don't, I'll tell you, I'll be very honest with you. We don't want anyone harassing anyone else about their votes. This will be anonymous. All right.
Arlene, just to comment a little bit on kind of just this voting issue generally, something the 4 co-chairs have talked about. I know we've said before that, we really view this as a last resort because we do not anticipate that issues that get dealt with through this kind of voting process, which however we do it is going to be imperfect, right, are going to carry as much weight. The senator's task, charge to us was identify items of consensus. So anything that we can reach consensus on is going to be much more powerful and stand much greater likelihood of actually getting done. So I just want to remind people of that. And based upon the survey results, I think in, the conversation today, we still have people all over the place on these issues, right? I think we have still some pretty strong differences of opinion. There's various, camps or factions here, and I don't know how much progress we've made to break those down. And at the end of the day, if this sort of comes to a vote and we catalog where people are on the different issues, I'm not sure how much we'll have accomplished here and how much that will really change things. So, we're going to spend another couple hours tomorrow trying to sift through these issues and figure out if we can find consensus on anything, because those are the things that are going to give all of us a chance to, see some good things happen for our forests. I mean, I heard a couple things today in my mind that maybe could be consensus items. I urge everyone to think a little bit about that and think a little bit about what you heard today. Hopefully we all learned a little something from the different perspectives that were shared, and we can find some ways to actually, agree on some things, because, our forests are too important for the state, not just for the present, but for future generations, as Chief Mann reminded us. So I hope everyone thinks about that a little bit between now and our conversation tomorrow. And I want to thank Chief Mann again for joining us and sharing his time and his perspective with us.
All right.
Those are my
Chief Mann
concluding
has his
thoughts. I don't
hand
know if
up.
the other
Yeah,
co-chairs have.
Well, Chief Mann has his
concluding-
hand up real quick, so okay, go ahead, Chief
Man, did you want to?
Yeah.
Before we close.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'll be traveling tomorrow. It'll be the first time that Michaeline and I are going on a vacation in about 8 years. So unfortunately, I won't be able to attend tomorrow. And I just wanted to just throw out, there is something I want to ask about the voting, obviously, but then there is also just one thing I wanted to simply ask, right? And that question was, how many years does it take for an oak tree to produce acorns, right? And a oak tree that is planted today, right? I'm 54 years old next week. I won't see that, right? But it's not even necessarily me, because there's hundreds of species, including the Ramapo Muncie people, right, that rely on just that one thing, that little acorn. And that, we think about it, that's just incredible. Can you imagine that if our women wouldn't become pregnant until they were 50 to 100 to 120 years old? That life here as human beings would go, right, would just not exist. So I just wanted to bring that up, right? There's more to think about than just the regular science, and personal opinions of things. The other part of that is that I just wanted to verify that, Michaeline and I, in particularly when we were asked, to be a part of this, that we were acknowledged as being, I'm the Turtle Clan chief of the Ramapo Lenape Nation, right? And I am a governmental entity, right? As stated by the state of New Jersey, in our state recognition by law. So I just wanted to bring that up because it is imperative that, the 10,000 Ramapos have a voice, never mind the fact that we don't have anybody on here from the other two tribes, which represent another 20,000 people. 30,000 people here in the state of New Jersey is, when it comes to voting, right, can sway, a vote for anybody, on all levels. So I just wanted to bring that to everyone's awareness. And Michaeline and I surely look forward to continuing this conversation, because quite frankly, we're talking about our indigenous culture and ways of life. And I didn't hear anybody else say anything to that regard other than myself. And this again, right, is something that has been missing, over the last 300 years, and it's important that the indigenous people's voices aren't just heard, but are included, and that, the outside world looks at us and looks to us, right, for our local indigenous knowledge, to help heal and to continue to heal our forests and our Mother Earth. So again, thank you.
Okay. Anything else from the co-chairs that we need to cover before we close?
This recording, it takes a little bit for Zoom to reprocess this recording, but I will make it available in the G Drive for everybody. Co-chairs, I don't think we're having everybody present again, right?
Oh,
Six
correct.
people
Yeah.
tomorrow. So whoever has not joined today that is joining tomorrow, we're going to encourage them to watch the recording from today. That will be available tonight, in a little bit. Eileen, Tom, Andy, did I miss anything?
Nope. All right. We'll see a lot of you tomorrow.
Yes, thank you, everybody.